second lecture today. Second speaker is Professor Çağlar Keyder, and the title of the lecture is Projects in the Absence of Signposts. Professor Keyder is professor of sociology. He teaches at the Atatürk Institute for Modern Turkish History, Bogazici University, I hope I pronounce it correctly, Istanbul, and also State University New York, Binghamton. Professor Keyder is a member of the Turkish Academy of Sciences. His research focuses primarily on historical sociology, political economy, and urban sociology, or more concretely on the Ottoman Empire, the contemporary Middle East and Turkey, and on the social structure of global crisis. His main publications are the definition of a peripheral economy, then state and class in Turkey, a study in capitalist development, and Istanbul between the global and the local. There are, of course, as always in such case, so many essays. I'll skip it, but he's also co-editor of Spatial Conceptions of the Nation, Modernizing Geographies in Greece and Turkey, and also Ways to Modernity in Greece and Turkey, Encounters with Europe. So I think you got some idea of what is the focus of interest of Professor Keyder. Professor Keyder, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. Honored to be here. I would like to follow on the introduction and the first lecture, speaking of the importance of 1989 and also of the importance of 9/11, which are in fact punctuating points of the narrative that I would like to advance. We do know, of course, there have been huge changes in the last 2 decades, and these are not only political, but social and economic as well. And they have had differential impact on different zones of the world, on the core, and the periphery, Europe, America, Eastern Europe, Western Europe. Of course, most directly, and I suppose that is in fact the reason why we are all convened here, the most direct impact was on Eastern Europe in 1989, but the indirect impacts were also momentous. Perhaps most importantly, as already was mentioned, the dream of an alternative world social order was dashed. But less less important perhaps in some respects, but from this vantage point at least, the notion that one was, as a society, secure in a particular camp, and the rules were well known, and that security actually perhaps narrowed the horizon, but at the same time gave a certain momentum and a certain direction to all the projects. That certainty was lost. Now Turkey, as in many other peripheral countries, had enjoyed that kind of security, being part of the free world. So it was in that camp quite squarely. And for these societies who were in that camp, and for those among those societies which were thought to be backward, developing, not yet there, not yet modern, struggling with tradition, etc., for them, to be modern as depicted in the free world was the unchallenged goal. The dominant thought was that there is a course of modernization, a determined path. To reject it was retrograde. To reject it was to remain in folly, to wallow in tradition. But the idea was that this modernization was not going to happen by itself. It required an intentionality, it required a project, it required elites to guide it, to lead it. And unlike in the 19th century, for instance, in the Marxist tradition, simply the transformation of the economy would not be sufficient. There was all kinds of things that had to be done, all kinds of things that had to be directed to modernize the society by a leadership. So politics and social life, law, daily practice, even clothes and food and child-rearing practices all had to change. Something, of course, could remain, and what remained was variously termed culture, sometimes religion, but in effect, what remained would not be all that important because it would be in the private sphere. It would be folklore. It wouldn't be real in the sense that it mattered in the society. A project this total requires, of course, a world historical structure of intellectual power with its rewards and sanctions. In fact, the intellectual history behind this conception of modernization was, of course, very rich. It started with the Enlightenment, and almost all the social scientists of the 19th century were worried about the form that this transition would take. Nonetheless, of course, that is not sufficient. There has to be material rewards. There has to be what has been called a hegemony. As we know, hegemony means a leadership which convinces that the rewards will be shared by those people, by those elites in this case, who participate, who subscribed to the project. And in fact, the narrative of modernization was an integral component of American hegemony during this period. The period, of course, is post-Second World War. Now, of course, we are more familiar, and we, at least those of us on the left, talk more about the sanctions that were imposed by the US, the Cold War tactics, the threats, the interventions, the wars. But at the same time, we must not forget that the US introduced post-World War II an idea that development was something that could be achieved and that was a right to be enjoyed by all the countries. The notion of developmentalism, the notion of American hegemony, embracing a set of institutions that would permit, that would allow this sort of development for all these developing countries, was in fact a very important dimension of leadership, a very important dimension of hegemony. These were the material underpinnings. This, in fact, worked quite well until the 1970s. And as we know, from the 1970s on, we enter a period, especially for these developing countries, a period of serious crisis, a period of crisis where the path is no longer clear, where the project doesn't seem to convince any longer. And one aspect of this was that this economic crisis that the periphery as a whole had to endure was something that the hegemonic power did not really feel compelled to do anything about. The US became more and more self-enclosed, more and more looking after its own interests, and as a result, and of course I have to be very summary here, as a result its hegemony became less secure. Now, what is important, I think, from looking from here of this period where American hegemony is not so secure, is that there was some alternative that was coming up, that was rising. And that alternative was another dimension or another aspect, another direction of the West. In other words, Europe. So this period, I think, of let us say, declining or challenged American hegemony, is also the harbinger of another possibility of Western modernity in the form of the experience of Europe. So I would say that in the 80s, this new element of the world order, this new appearance, this new avatar of the modern West, was that of Europe with a more benign face, but it was still within the West. It was a more responsible leader in a sense, Europe, but we can't really see this as a rivalry with the US. It was more of a partnership, more of a situation where the benign face, the face that was more encompassing, the face that was perhaps more attractive for various reasons, was finally coming into a more concrete appearance. Until then, modernization paradigm had thought of the US as the most advanced, and therefore European countries would simply follow in its track. It was a unilinear path. You couldn't waver. And as we know, as Marx said, the most advanced simply showed where the less advanced would be going in the near future. So the idea was European countries would catch up. They would become just like America. For the time when American hegemony was secure, this was the model. But of course, before that, in the 19th century and later as well, early 20th century, there had been many people writing about Europe versus America as two quite different modernities. Tocqueville and Weber are perhaps the most famous. As American ability to convince, as American hegemony became less hegemonic, less convincing, these different modernities within the West were rediscovered. These were variously identified as Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism was one, continental difference was another, but I think the most significant one, or the most descriptive one at least, is what was called the varieties of capitalism school. I think varieties of capitalism school is something that is perhaps neglected in talking about modernities and multiple modernities and different, because in fact within the West, varieties of capitalism school identified that there were multiple modernities. So this situation, the fact that Europe could now be conceived as something somehow different, introduced another horizon within the free world. In fact, unexpectedly, the fall of the wall reinforced this division. Because America seemed to have won the Cold War and announced the end of history, end of challenges to liberal democracy, and American scholars and NGOs and philanthropists felt empowered to preach versions of the modernization paradigm. They went around in Eastern Europe, as you all know, trying to build the institutional framework for private property markets, open elections, especially arrogant, of course, in the Eastern European canvas. But the surprise was that within a few years, Eastern European countries reverted to Europe. In fact, very early in the 90s, there was the relationships with the EU were strengthened. Association agreements were signed. In 97, candidacy was recognized for the first 10 countries of the ex-Soviet bloc. It looked as if the Europeans were going to collect the rewards, rather than the US, which presumably had, by itself, won the Cold War. So, in this sense, Europe's appearance as an alternative, as a different kind of modernity, more benign, etc., became even more reinforced. The Europeans were now able to say, that they were expanding, they were encompassing, they were integrating, they were welcoming, and they were doing it all on their own terms, because the EU, in its institutional framework, is extremely different, very different from what goes on in America. Now, of course, we must remember that Europe looked very attractive because of basically two things. One was that its governance model was very different. It was ready, as many people said, ready for cosmopolitan democracy. It was based on networks. It was based on non-hierarchical ways of doing things. It was based on the rule of law absolutely through the Court of Justice. That was the first thing, and it was considered that for these times of globalization, it was a very appropriate model that could be expanded to cover the entire globe. The second point was that compared to the ugly side of American capitalism, of course, Europe was identified with social welfare, better income distribution, more of a solidaristic social thought in terms of taking care of the society, etc. Now, through the 90s, Europe as an alternative within the Western framework grew in the horizon. As you can guess, all this came to an end with 9/11. I think with 9/11, expectations of an independent trajectory, an independent possibility of social development were shattered. First, the European elites tried to distance themselves from the emerging neocon unilateralism in the US. As you will remember, there were maybe a year, 2 years of indeterminacy. It wasn't clear if the Europeans would cave in, but then they did. They went along with the new unilateralism. They accepted the trampling of international law. They accepted the new narrative of West under attack, and that there was, in fact, some civilizational divide. In fact, they joined in with American leadership to unify the West for a war that wasn't clear what purpose it served. Now, even if the social structural differences persisted between the US and Europe, Europe did not look like it was offering an alternative anymore. I think its moment had passed. But this narrowing of the horizon, in fact, accelerated the depreciation of the West's appeal. Fear and panic, decline of sympathy in the world, the wars with all their humanitarian costs, indirectly related to this, related to imperial overstretch, a rapacious capitalism, a new wave of commodification. Some people call it, David Harvey calls it, accumulation by dispossession. Irresponsible behavior in terms of the economy, threatening the world order, especially in America, of course, but London and Frankfurt were not far behind. The domination of Wall Street over the entire economy, the credit economy, and the kind of crisis that it led to. A hubris without a coherent narrative. No credible project to offer. Exaggerated fear, xenophobia, overt and covert harping on Islam as the new enemy. All these seem to serve social control because times were quite changing, transforming, but all this also seemed to lead to a crash landing of American hegemony. Now, what this suggests is that this multiplying of hegemonic alternatives that was provided by Europe's rising were also shrunk because of Europe becoming part of the American project. The problem is, for the world as a whole, there is no alternative hegemonic project. So with the West, in fact, losing its bearings, there is a vacuum. There are all kinds of alternatives that seem to come up, but nothing that is encompassing as American hegemony used to be. There are regional arrangements, there are attempts to recreate various empires. The Chinese seem to impose their tributary system on the rest of Asia. The Turks are talking about Ottoman Empire resurgent. There are challenges to liberalism. There is, of course, the notion of a new authoritarian capitalism, illiberal capitalism. And there is, in fact, what this means is that there's no wholesale surrender to one type of modernization. Now, I would like to look at this whole episode from this point of view, in other words, from Turkey, because I think Turkey was important because it was on the front lines of this entire struggle. Now, of course, hegemony was global, and modernization, the type of modernization that I talked about, was imposed on all kinds of countries. But Turkey was special because it had been on the front line between the West and the East for a very long time. And it was essential for the self-definition of the West. Since the 16th century, it had been the intimate adversary. It had been the first entity to be othered. Once, however, the Ottomans accepted that they were failing, and once they accepted West's superiority, the elites felt the need to prove themselves. This is, of course, a well-known paradox written up by people who wrote about peripheral nationalisms. On the one hand, protesting a glorious past, but also, on the other hand, the need to imitate, the need to do the kinds of things that were dictated by the West. A feeling of insufficiency. The elites felt this, and it was, in fact, communicated to the masses as well, because they had to be disciplined into following the same project. When development and modernization worked, and this is roughly until the 1970s, the process seemed to continue without too many problems. But then, as I mentioned, we ran into doldrums, a floundering, doubts about abandoning the kind of elite-directed, modernizing development. The state elites were, of course, reluctant to give up their project. They were reluctant to give up their authority. And in fact, it was in this atmosphere, which coincided with the rise of alternative modernity coming from Europe, that the EU came to rescue. Because the prospect of EU membership now became something that was just as important as a project as modernization had been. It wasn't simply an economic option. It was, the project of the EU was almost a total surrender to all the institutions, all the legal framework, all the politics, all the political arrangements that the EU could provide. It was an anchor that until then had lacked. The anchor because had been the elites trying to modernize actively, but now it was a very different kind of relationship with the West. And this is why it was important that Europe had proved its autonomy. For most of the population, the road to membership would bring political and economic reform, rehabilitate law, expand the public sphere, especially because of the governance and the social welfare dimensions that were so attractive. The first disappointment in this path of membership in the European Union came in 1989. As you can imagine, this was a situation where an outside member was an outside country, was now being scorned because it wasn't close enough to the core. Eastern European countries were obviously welcomed as long-lost members of the family. So Christianity came on the agenda as being something important to cohere all the members. And the question of where does Europe end? What is Europe? Is it in fact a Christian partnership? All this came on the agenda, and as you can imagine, a country like Turkey, which was on the outside, which was hoping to make the entry, could now feel that it was being cast to the sides. But nonetheless, the 90s were a period which were expansionary for the European Union. There were all kinds of initiatives. There was the former, well, first of course the Eastern European countries were welcomed, and then there was an initiative towards the Mediterranean. In fact, Romano Prodi once said that the task of the European Union was to reconstitute the Roman Empire, which was as expansionary as you could get. During this period, this sort of euphoria of expansion, the EU became very active in Turkey without going through the state. It became active in funding projects. NGOs extended their networks. Members of the European Parliament would visit all the time, and they were involved in the internal politics and the internal contestation that was going on in Turkey. The European Court of Human Rights became, again, something very integral to the Turkish legal system, worked as a court of appeals. And all these made the prospect of membership in Europe a very popular thing. In fact, this was a reversal because it wasn't any longer the elite that was pushing for this sort of westernization, but was now a popular will. Now, as you will know, after all this, in 1999, Turkey was formally accepted as a candidate country, and negotiations started. And for some time after that, although this period was punctuated by 9/11, for some time after that, it looked as if everything was going fine. The political party that came to lead, that became the government in 2002, which is still the governing party, was very much involved in pushing for membership and went through all the paces in terms of the reforms and in terms of the chapters that were being opened, etc., etc. And it looked as if that things were going to go smoothly. But then after 9/11, also some things began to change. It was suddenly remembered that Turkey was overwhelmingly Muslim. The Turkish government became more serious, and that made the Europeans less willing to go ahead as rapidly as they could. European leaders began to voice their hesitation. The Christian essence of Europe came on the agenda when they were discussing the Constitution, whether the Christianity should be part of the Constitution, should be mentioned in the Constitution. The EU, as you can imagine, was arguing about its own essence. Was it going to engage in cultural closure, or was it going to be a liberal hegemonic project that would expand? But after the years 2004, 2005, unemployment and social transformation fueled a new type of hostility toward immigrants. And in Europe, most countries in Europe, nativism and closure became the preferred choice. Europe's horizons narrowed drastically. I want to talk about the impact of this narrowing on Turkey. Perhaps it is too soon to tell, but it is ironic that this new closure of Europe and the dispersal of power and economic potential to the rest of the world has been liberating for Turks. We don't have to pass the test or cram for the Western certificate any longer. There are new options which have the added advantage of following more smoothly without radical break from the country's cultural and historical heritage. These options do not reject the earlier commitment to radical Westernization. They are in dialogue with it. The national identity that was tailored carefully to create a rootless republican citizenry with allegiance only to the westernizing state is expanding to include within its folds not only religion and diverse ethnicities, but also the Ottoman past. Instead of seeing themselves through the European lens, Turks slowly are gaining a confidence in their own history and reality. As the suppressed dimensions of this recovered identity surface, the moral need for European approval subsides. The stigma that my generation grew up with, having to apologize for all that still appeared Oriental, no longer seems to hurt. There is an attempt to excavate the past, including all the episodes that had to be glossed over in order to sanitize the historical formation of Turkish identity. We are now comfortable talking about the Christian past of Anatolia, the conversions under Ottoman rule, the Armenian massacres, the tragedies of ethnic unmixing, the exchange of populations, and the injustice to those who had to leave their homes. We now know immeasurably more about the Kurds and the Alevis. We all have opinions, and we can more or less freely discuss the issues. This is an exciting flourishing of debate, and it can only lead to healthier construction of identity. There is no denying that this glasnost was achieved in part because of the reforms that were undertaken in response to conditions set out by the European Union. But the confidence with which they were taken up owes as much to the feeling that the West is no longer the only option. Closer links with neighboring countries, the so-called neo-Ottoman strategy of regional leadership, but perhaps more important, the attempts to diversify into China-dominated Asian spheres are a testimony to such self-confidence. In the recent visit of the Chinese premier, an agreement was signed in Ankara to build a new Orient Express railway from Istanbul to Shanghai. This is, of course, to rival the old Orient Express from Paris and London to Istanbul. Istanbul is no longer the bridge between East and West, a place of passage. It wasn't, in fact, under Ottoman times either. This narrative of the bridge, this metaphor, was a new invention. It has now become a destination. The proud denizens declared it to be the place to be. Maybe you'll find out. Opinion polls now suggest that fewer than 40% feel it would be a good thing for Turkey to join the EU. The figure was 75% in 2004. Half in those polls think that Turkish people have values that are sufficiently different from the West, that we cannot be part of it. They are more inclined to think that Turkey should cooperate with other Middle Eastern countries or even Russia. It would be wrong to assign this change of heart to the resurgence of a long-suppressed essential cultural identity. It is obviously a response to the Western attitude toward Islam as well. Without the rejection by Europe, without the rift that counterposed the Christian West against the Islamic other, there would be no such rethinking of history and identity. The good news is that this rethinking does not simply embrace a confrontational stance. It reflects more a confident and healthy disregard of the hostility, because there are other games to play. Hegemonic decline, the failure of Europe to pursue a separate identity, the closure of Western civilization along a religious definition, the implosion of the EU project have all contributed to Turkey's perceived turn to other directions. How this unfolds will depend on how the map of the world shapes up and when a stable set of directions appear. But for now, the horizon for Turkey is definitely wider.